In the previous video, we started to look at the different menus found in Unity, and we stopped at game object. We looked at the main game object's submenus. Now, we've got the components to look at. They are a big piece. They are all the things you can add to your objects that will appear here in the inspector. To demonstrate, I'm going to move the camera over here like this. I'm going to remove the text. I'm going to select the 3 cubes and lift them up like this. And I'm going to start the game. That means start it and play it. And you'll see what the player sees when they start the game. To start the game, just click on the little play button here. You launch the game. The first launch can be a little bit long, and there it is. This is the game as the player will see it. Obviously nothing much happens because we haven't set up anything. But it's just to explain that when you start the game, it runs and all the events will happen. So I'm going to select this cube here on the left, for example. I'm going to go to component and we're going to see what we can add to it. We have the mesh. So again, I'm not going to show you everything because there is a lot of things, but among the components that you'll use, we have the mesh renderer, which allows you to make an object visible. Here, if I deactivate the mesh renderer of this cube, it becomes invisible. I already showed you that in the previous video. You have the skinned mesh renderer, which you will find most often on the characters. Text Mesh Pro is a small tool that allows you to create more advanced text than the 3D text I showed you. You will have more parameters. In Effects, we have the particle system, which allows you to add a particle system to an object. When I introduced it here, I selected the particle system. It created a separate particle system here. It's really a separate object. But if I select the cube and I do component effects particle system, that means I want to add the particle system component to the cube. And the cube is the owner of the particle system. We can see that if I look in the inspector here, we find the particle system, which is on the cube, and there we have all the properties of the particle system. To deactivate a component, you can uncheck it, and if you can't uncheck it and you want to deactivate it, you can right-click, remove component, and it will delete the component. So that was the particle system. I also showed you the trail renderer. It allows you to create a kind of light trail behind an object. And the line renderer allows you to create a luminous line, a bit the same thing, except that the trail renderer has a lifetime. That is to say that the visual effect fades over time. By default, it has a lifetime of 5 seconds. After 5 seconds, it disappears. If you have a sword stroke, you give the sword stroke and you've got the movement of it, you will have the luminous effect that may be visible for a while. But the line renderer is more something that will stay visible on screen. From time to time, if I have examples that come to mind, I'll try to show you. On Portal, we see that for some puzzles, there are laser beams that are fired either by turrets or by projectors, and we can deflect these laser beams to solve puzzles. Well, you can do that with a line renderer. It's something that's going to stay visible, and you're going to be able to do this type of visual effect with the line renderer in Unity. So that's component effects, line renderer. The lens flare will be more, well, flare effects. If I find an example for you, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's a light bounce effect that you could find on a camera lens. These are small artifacts. This is an effect that we find in photography in general. And you can reproduce this effect in Unity. Here I see that we have this, which is also lens flare, but which is also called the halo. And this luminous halo effect, you can also find it in the effects, and here it is. We have the lens flare and the halo. to create the luminous effect that we have when we try to film the sun with a camera, for example. We have the physics properties. They will allow us to add physics to our objects. And physics 2D, same thing, but specific for 2D objects. We really have specific components for 3D and 2D objects. So in the main physics component, we'll find the rigid body. I've added it to the cube here, which is selected. It allows us to make an object affected by gravity. We see here that is as a mass. It will be able to have a resistance force. A physical object, if it slides on the ground, it will be slowed by the ground. If it falls, it's slowed by the air. So we can really adjust its physical properties. It can be affected by gravity. So use gravity, you can check or uncheck. Is it affected by gravity, yes or no? Is kinematic will make sure that our object is physical while preventing external forces from acting on it. In some cases, it may be necessary to have physics without the physics being fully applied. I'll try to find you some examples. Now, I know I've said it for a game, was with a dummy. If you know a little bit about ragdolls, when you're on an FPS and you shoot a character, the character dies and is thrown to the ground in the background. Well, in my game it was pretty much the same. I was in kinematic, so that by default the character would stay as it was. From the moment I had to simulate the fact that the character was falling to the ground, I would deactivate this is kinematic to apply the gravity effects on the object. Well, not sure you get the picture, but it's the first example that came to my mind about a project I worked on. You can add a rigid body to an object to have access to certain functions. We'll see when we start C#, we'll be able to do things, and with a rigid body we'll have access to certain functions. And we can wish to add a rigid body to have access to its functions while checking is kinematic, so that the external physical factors do not act on our object, but that we preserve the access to its functions. Well, enough blah blah, I just launched the game. So we have 3 cubes, 2 that we haven't touched, and the third one here, to which we have added the rigid body. Watch what happens. Boom, the cube falls to the ground. I run the game, and here it falls to the ground. Then I can check is kinematic, and the cube doesn't fall on the ground anymore. It's not affected. On the other hand, well, there it's not visible, but I will try to make you a small demonstration. I'm going to uncheck use gravity. I learned the game. If you uncheck use gravity, gravity doesn't apply anymore. We can position the cube somewhere. If I check use gravity during the game, the cube falls to the ground at that time. So basically you can enable or disable certain properties of the component at any time. At any time you can enable gravity. You can adjust the mass of the object so that it's more or less heavy, so that the impact is more or less important. And you can also play with constraints of the object. The object can rotate, and we have the possibility of blocking certain rotation axes. You can really block certain properties of the object. You can lock its rotation on the X, Y, or Z axis, or you can lock its position also on the X, Y, or Z axis. That is, if I activate gravity and I block the Y axis, which is this axis, I put a constraint on the Y axis, well, I'll have gravity, but because of the constraint, the cube won't fall. If I disable the constraint, it can fall. Same with rotation. I try to show this. Here, I have the cube like this, which is a bit tilted. I drop it to the ground. And you see that the physics engine calculates to make the cube fall back, which is normal. Physically, the cube has to fall back flat to the ground. If you create, for example, a wooden box that falls to the ground, it will fall like this. The physics engine calculates something realistic. If I put a constraint now, where was I? I was on the z-axis. If I put a constraint on the z-axis for the rotation, I run the project. Now the cube falls to the ground, and because there is a z rotation constraint, it will stay like that. The physics engine makes its calculations, but respect the constraints that we have indicated. If I remove the constraint on the z-axis, the cube will fall back to the ground. So that's it for constraints, gravity, etc. Still in the physical components, we have the colliders. They will allow you to make your objects solid. By default, we have them on our objects. If we create a box, we'll have a box collider. If we have a sphere, we'll have a sphere collider. I'm going to create a sphere here, game objects, 3D object, and I'm going to create a sphere here, which I can place over there. The sphere has a collider. If you look at it, we have a sphere collider, and I can change the radius of this collider. You can see the radius here. It's a little green outline. So we have the possibility of modifying the radius, and if I add a component to it, I actually can go here through the Add Component menu. I can search for the component among all this. So we said physics, and then we have rigid body somewhere. If you know the component you want to add, just search it. I start typing rigid, and it filters out anything that starts with rigid, and I find rigid body or rigid body 2D. I select the rigid body that is more appropriate for 3D objects, and it adds the rigid body to my sphere, which has a slightly larger collider. So if I run the game, the sphere will fall to the ground, but it will look like it's floating because of the collider. It's not really that it's floating, but that the collider is bigger than the sphere itself. So, by default, when we create a 3D object, we have a collider that is added. The floor we created together, it has a collider here, and this collider is a mesh collider. It's a collider that will follow the shape of the 3D model, no matter what shape the 3D model is. Even if it's a twisted model, complex one, the mesh collider will make sure that it matches the shape of the object. It's a type of collider that is a bit more complex to calculate than a simple box collider, so use it, but don't overuse it. If I deactivate this collider, it means that the floor is no longer solid. If I deactivate the collider, we don't have this solid aspect of the ground anymore. So, if I run the game, you'll see that the cube and the sphere will go through the floor and fall forever because there's no more collision. Without collider, there is no collision, and so our objects fall. So I'm going to re-enable the collision here, I'm going to re-enable the mesh collider, and, well, I'm just going to show you something. I have to check the convex property, which is a property... in fact, you can have either convex or concave shapes. Again, I'm going to try to find you some examples to show you the difference between convex and concave. A concave shape, we're going to be able to dig a little bit to fit the shape perfectly. Here the images are not very high quality, but you may understand the principle. We're going to be able to really fit the shape. And convex, we're going to base ourselves on the shape of the 3D model, but we're going to go over the sides. Here you can see that either we have a wide collider that encompasses the object, or we have something very, very precise that will really be placed all around each polygon. Here we have a collider that will really manage the collision very precisely on the object. Or here we have a collider, I don't know if you see, but here it's actually solid. We have a big polygon here that will just surround the shape, and globally the shape will be solid. But if you need much more precision, you'll be in concave. And then you might have something in the digger that could move inside. That's not the case here. You can't get into the hole of the shell because the collider creates a collision object that surrounds the whole shape. That's the difference between convex and concave. But that's not why I wanted to activate the convex mode, it's just that for this type of collider I have to activate the convex mode to be able to check the is trigger property. which is a property that we'll use a lot. You'll see why. I re-enable the collider, but I checked isTrigger. I run the game, and then look at the objects going through. So the collider is activated, but the objects are going through. The isTrigger property allows to still detect collisions, no problem, it's still detecting when there's a collision, but it doesn't prevent the object from passing through. isTrigger is well a trigger. We're going to be able to trigger an event, and in fact trigger colliders are used in video games to detect collisions at specific moments in the game scenario, to trigger events. Imagine you have a cinematic. To trigger the cinematic, the character has to enter the castle, while you're going to put a collider to detect the collision between the character and the castle. If the character touches this collider, it means he's in the castle, but you don't want the character to be prevented from entering the castle, it doesn't make sense. So you're going to check isTrigger, which is going to allow us to detect the collision without preventing the player from moving forward. And we're going to be able to trigger the cinematic at the moment the player enters the castle. As we've detected the collision, we know that he's there, we trigger the cinematic. So that's one use of the isTrigger property, and it's everywhere. On the cube I also have this property here. So here we are in the physics components. We have the rigid body for gravity, the collider for collision management. I don't know if we'll see this in detail. I'll see if I make bonus videos, but these are really specific components if you want to create games where all the gameplay is based on physics. We can create links between two objects, for example, spring joint. It's going to be kind of a wall of a spring. We can create a spring link. I'll try to show you this. We can create a fixed link, which means that two objects will be linked and will always remain at the same distance. With the spring, it's not the same. The objects can move depending on the strength of the spring. The character joint is more for the characters to be able to connect the arm to the body, the legs to the body. It's really going to allow you to connect the different members of the body all together to create the joints. I'm going to try to give you a little demonstration. I'm going to put a spring joint on this cube here. So this cube here has a spring joint. I'm going to place it over here. Oh yes, I didn't tell you, but you can move the view of the camera with this little thingy on the right here. That will allow you to turn and look at the top view, bottom view, etc. So I'm going to put the cube here. I'm going to put a second cube over there, but the second cube will be a little bit higher than the first one. Then the camera, I'm going to move it back a little bit so I can see better. And this cube here, I'm going to add a rigid body to it. Game object, no, sorry, component. Physics, rigid body. I'm going to check the property. Where is it? I'm going to check the property isKinematic. Because to connect two joints together, I need both objects to be rigid body, as here I added the spring joint to this one. You can see the spring joint component, and you can see that in order to connect one object to another, you can only connect it to a rigid body. So I need this object to be a rigid body in order to connect it. So here we have the connected body, which is cube number 2. I go to cube number 1, I take cube number 2, and I drag it here on the connected body. So cube 1 is now connected to cube number 2. And so I needed to add a rigid body for this, and I checked the isKinematic property because I don't want this one to be affected by gravity. I'm just going to uncheck the trail renderer because it bothers me more than anything else. So if you're still with me, I've added the spring joint to this cube here, so that's the spring links. I connected the rigid body to it. This rigid body at the bottom is not in kinematic, so it is affected by gravity. This cube will fall, and this cube is not affected by the forces, so it will stay fixed. It will not move. The spring joint is quite complex. You have a lot of properties: the maximum distance you can stretch the spring, the force of the spring, the force that will define when the spring will break. If you pull very, very hard on a spring, it will eventually break, so you can define the break force. Here it's infinite, it means it will never break. You have a very precise control over all the spring's properties. So I'm not going to do a lecture on joints, but I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm going to run the game. Just remember, I've connected two rigid bodies together. We've got one that's fixed, one that is affected by gravity, and they're connected by a spring joint. You see, we have a spring that connects the two cubes together, and then little by little the movement will slow down because of the frictional forces of the air, and it will eventually calm down. And here we see in red on the interface here, it's just for you developer to debug the situation. You can see how the springs are connected. You can see the springs attachment point here. So just play with it. If you lift the cube and move it in the game, you'll already be able to play with the spring here. And the physics engine does all the calculations for you. And you can also play with the properties of the rigid body. If you want to freeze the position, we can actually block the cube, and we can really multiply all the physics properties to be able to create a physics-based game. I'm not going to spend too much time on the springs. We're going to continue exploring the physical components. So here we saw all that, and we have the constant force. I will say 2 words about it. Constant force, as the name suggests, will allow us to create a constant force that's going to be applied to your game. And it could be, for example, an area, and if you're moving on that area, the constant force could be, for example, an upward propulsion force, sort of reverse gravity, and if your character walks in the area of constant force, you can propel them up into the air, as if there was a negative gravity. Anyway, once again, I'll try, for those who are interested, to make little bonus videos to present these different types of components, practical cases. I'll ask you about adding bonuses video, but there are not things that we use very regularly. 2D physics, well, we find exactly the same thing but specific for 2D objects. In navigation, this is for coding artificial intelligences that can move autonomously. We can create characters that can walk around in a city or on a terrain, so the components of navigation will be used for that. Audio is for adding audio components. The audio listener is for hearing sounds. You only need one person, otherwise you'll have bugs. Audio source, this is everything that can produce sounds. You can have as many as you want in the scene. These are the only 2 components that you will use all the time. And then really for the professionals who want to go a lot further, you have the ability to have a whole bunch of audio properties to make sound very precise. For example, if you shout outside or if you shout in a church, the sound is not the same. You know this effect very well. It's the reverb. Here we have the audio reverb zone, so you have the possibility to create very realistic sounds according to the physical properties of the objects around you. You have access to all these parameters to do that. Again, these are quite complex, quite advanced options. They're really for, I would say, professionals, big studios. In our case, the audio listener and the audio source are more than enough for everything we'll be doing. The video, I also talked about it, is to add a video player. You can add a video player to an object, for example on the floor. Here I'm going to do component video player, and here I've added a video player to my floor. To demonstrate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to download a random video from Pixabay here. I'm uploading a video in MP4 format, so here it's just cherry blossoms. I take the video and drag it into the Unity project. So here I've added an MP4 video, and what we've just done is added the video player on the floor. And I just drag my video clip into the video clip property so I can add the video. You've got lots of properties like play on awake to play the video when the game starts. You can check the loop property to play the video in a loop. You've got the playback speed to play fast forward or slow motion. You have the possibility to act on the tone of the video if there's sound. In short, each time you have access to a whole bunch of settings, but if I leave the default settings already, like this, you can see that I have my video here, which launches on the floor. Well, this is a basic video, but you can make your own cinematic for your games and trigger it like that. Then you just have to make sure that the shot is facing the camera to broadcast your video in full screen. So here's the video player and an example of how to use it. It's very simple. You just add the video player and drag your video in MP4 format. So that was for the video. In rendering, we have the possibility to manage the cameras, to manage the skybox, the light, all that. In general, we don't touch it too much. Tile map is more for 2D. We'll look at that in detail later, but it will allow you to create 2D maps based on a tile system. Tiles are small textures, for example 32 by 32 pixels, that you can create and paste to create a giant map. What else is there that you might be interested in? Not much. Not much. In the UI menu, these are the items for the user interface. I already explained it to you. It's what allows you to create menus, create a main menu, a pause menu, an inventory system. So that's all UI, user interface, and you'll be able to find the components here. I think I've pretty much covered the most important things that we'll often use. And in any case, during the course, we will come back to these different menus and use them a little more. I'm really doing a quick tour of the menus to show you all this. We have the window menu, which allows you to adjust the window. You have the possibility at the bottom to find all the parts of the Unity window. If you leave the scene by pressing the middle mouse button, but you didn't want to, you lose the scene. If you want to display it again, you go to Window, General, Scene. There the scene reappears and I can again dock it at the top of my screen. So here you can find all the different windows in Unity. There is one thing that is quite important, it's the package manager. We'll come back to that later. The package manager is a little tool that will allow you to add features to Unity. By default in Unity there are a certain number of functionalities, but not all are installed by default. So you have to go here to the Unity registry to access the additional features, and you can install more individual components to Unity to be able to use them. We don't have everything in Unity by default to prevent a project to be too heavy or too overloaded. So as soon as we need to install additional things, we go to the package manager. The asset store is the Unity shop that allows you to download a whole bunch of pre-configured resources, 3D models, entire worlds, characters, scripts, a whole bunch of things. And finally, to save your work, you go in File, here, Save As, to save your scene. We'll save it in the Scenes folder, and I can call it Test, for example. I do Save, I do Ctrl-N to create a new scene. So there I lost my work, but as I saved it, it's in Scene. Test, I double-click, and there it reopens my work. A scene is basically like a level in a video game. You can create level 1, level 2, 3, 4, so it's going to be the different zones to explore in your video game. I know I'm going over everything quite quickly and there are a lot of notions to remember, but just try to manipulate Unity as the same time as I do, so you can start memorize it all. And again, we'll come back in more detail as we go along in the different videos of the course, because we'll be reusing all of these components as we develop our project. I'll stop here for this video and see you in the next one.